Now the Covenanter cruiser tank, which is the tank we're looking at the moment, is quite an interesting vehicle. I know I've talked about it before. I added it to the list of really awful tanks, and there are awful features about it, but at the moment we're looking at it as a fighting tank in its own right and trying to be slightly more positive about it. However, to start off with, the first thing I'd say is that in railway circles in particular, they always used to say that a really correct looking engine with everything in the right place, if it looked right, it usually was right, it behaved right. And it appears that that doesn't apply to tanks, because in many respects the Covenanter's not a bad looking tank. It's got 4 large road wheels, it's got a very sleek hull, a very streamlined turret, and you'd think it would be an excellent tank. But for a variety of reasons it turned out not to be. It's got Christie suspension, which was quite good in those days, up to a limit of weight anyway, so it's got a bit of freedom in the wheels here. This actual tank was dug up. It was found on a farm on the North Downs near Dorking, and that probably accounts for the fact that it's in a bit of a state. But it was dug up, and they thought it was a Tiger, of course, well they would do, wouldn't they? And gave it to the Tank Museum because they couldn't think of anything else to do with it. We sent it up to workshops and we had all the tin work remade. That's all new. It's only the basic hull of the tank which is original, but workshops unfortunately put the more modern sort of fire extinguishers on. They're not quite correct, but they'll do for now until we get better ones. It's got a plaque on the front telling people where it came from, but all the markings are exactly as we found on the tank. So we know which regiment it belonged to, which company within the regiment, really quite an interesting set of markings in a way. So all that is authentic, and that's more than I can say for some of the other tanks in here. The gun, for instance, isn't. The tank itself, the original Covenanter, had a 2-pounder gun, though except for the close support versions. And I think this one's actually got a 40mm Bofors barrel stuck in, which goes to the back of the turret. It's a bit too long, but it gives the right impression, and that's all we're out for at the moment. The tank will never run again. It's in too much of a state. I think inside, in fact, it's still much as it was when it was dug up, and it's hardly worth bothering with, but they've made quite a good job of the outside. But that's the history of the tank. Otherwise, I don't think we'd have a Covenanter here. Because the Covenanter was regarded as an awful tank, no effort was made to preserve one for the museum. And I've always believed that we ought to show tanks warts and all, in other words, all their awful features as well, and have them lined up with the better tanks, so that people can see how not every tank we made was good, and the Covenanter certainly wasn't. And it gives people some idea of how awful some of our tanks were, if they're interested, that is. The basic design is very good. It's very low because they didn't want any vertical surfaces on it at all. Vertical surfaces are an invitation for anti-tank rounds to hit, and by doing so many horizontal bits, you're cutting that down considerably, and that's quite a feature. It's powered by a Meadows horizontally opposed 12-cylinder engine in the back, which really drives it along reasonably fast when it's going, which isn't always. They did originally plan on giving it the Merritt Brown gearbox, but that was too new and too unreliable, so they used ordinary clutch and brake steering on it. And they were going to make the road wheels of light alloy. But the Royal Air Force intervened and said, I'm sorry, we've got all the alloy we need, we want it all, so you'll have to make the wheels of something else, and they're made of steel. That added to the weight. Originally, they were also going to weld the tank. It was going to be Britain's first welded cruiser tank. But as usual, they didn't like the idea of welding. It was too new. And the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, the LMSR as it was known in those days, was the main parent for the design of the Covenanter, and they hadn't got the welders in the workshops. They had plenty of riveters, but by riveting the tank, you're immediately putting in a subframe, because you can't put two plates together and rivet them together. You've got to rivet each plate to a subframe, and that immediately puts the weight up. So with that and the road wheels, the weight was already getting up, creeping up before the tank had even been built. And then the government came along and said, oh, we want to make our cruisers 30mm of armour instead of less. And so the weight went up again. And in the end, the tank, when it left the factory at Crewe, which is the first place they were built, was so heavy it was already just about on limit to what the suspension could take. So you couldn't expect it to be improved in any way. And all these things didn't help. We'll come to the worst of them in a minute. The driver lives in here. He's got a little box to look out of. Originally, they gave the driver a Beezer machine gun to fire out of the side of the driver's hatch, but that filled the driver's cab with fumes, so they said it was probably better if he just fired a revolver out if he needed to. I don't think there's any evidence of them ever doing that. I think the bloke was too busy driving the tank to fire a gun, but still, it had the provision to do it. The other three men, so you've got four altogether, the other three men are in the turret: the commander, the gunner, and the loader. Again, they've done the turret with that angular side to it, and it's done so that the men can, inside the turret, who are fairly cramped, can at least get their elbows in a little bit. It's just to give them a bit more freedom. It's got a coaxial machine gun, as you can see, be a Beezer in this case, and a smoke discharger alongside it. So it's, in every respect, quite an ordinary tank. The trouble is, the real horror of the tank is the way the thing's arranged. Because it's got that 12-cylinder engine, flat engine in the back, it's taking up rather a lot of room as far as ancillary equipment's concerned. And the biggest problem, it being a water-cooled engine, was the radiator. So what they did, and I think it's crackers, but still, if you're ever designing a tank, by the way, don't do this, it's not a good idea. They put both the radiators underneath these louvers at the front, to the left of the driver. It meant that the tank had perfectly good situation for the radiators, but they were well away from the engine. It also meant that pipes full of hot water could be pumped through the fighting compartment to the radiator to cool down, and then back again as cold water. And of course, one thing you don't need, particularly in the desert, is a heated fighting compartment. It gets quite warm in there anyway. So all those things were against it. But not only that, the cooling didn't work. The pipes leaked, and they had a lot of trouble with them. They had trouble with the transmission. And in the end, although they built something like 1,200 of these, not just by the LMS, by other companies as well, they built about 1,200 of these tanks. None of them ever went into action for the British Army at all. In fact, not with any army. They were not used in action. A few went out to the desert for trials, but generally they stayed in Britain and were used for training. They were trained, among other things, they trained the Guards Armoured Division on tanks. They learned all there was to know about tanks. And there is something to be said for giving the crews awful tanks to train on, because they've got to learn how to get their hands dirty, putting it right. They've got to work on the tank as well as drive it. And it's all good training, but I don't think it's something to be made a big thing of. The other interesting thing about it are the tracks. They're only narrow, and you'll find this on most early British cruisers. They're a lot narrower than they should be, and they don't really spread the weight. They take the weight, but only just. And that's another feature of them. It's a dry pin track anyway, going all the way round under there, with guide horns at the bottom. The road wheels are in pairs, and so you've got the guide horn down the centre to keep it on. But that's how the tank's designed. And it came up with so many faults when it first appeared that it never got into action. And that's the saddest thing of all. At a time when Britain was desperate for tanks, when we were really short of them, we couldn't use this one for action at all. Only one was knocked out by enemy action, and that was near Canterbury in Kent. It was hit by a bomb, from an attacking German aircraft. The tank itself at the time was attached to a Polish armoured train operating in Kent, and it was the only Covenanter actually knocked out by enemy action. All the rest were mainly used for training around this country. There's plenty of photos of them, but they never saw action, never went into a fight anywhere. And that really is quite a condemnation, if you like, for what is otherwise, or should have been, quite a good tank. Okay, now if you enjoyed that bit of film, or any of the bits of film we've made, if you'd subscribe to YouTube, that helps us a great deal. And more so if you'll support Patreon, because that's something that we really can do with. Thanks very much. So what they did, and I think it's crackers, but still, if you're ever designing a tank, by the way, don't do this, it's not a good idea.